Hello, I'm Conan Elphick, and welcome to the second of two EPs featuring highlights from the hit podcast, The History Blokes. I hope you enjoy. In the ninth EP, I had much to say on the history of Anzac Day.
Here's a question for you, Chris. So given that the Anzac landings were very clearly entrenched in the national consciousness so quickly, when do you think the first Anzac Day was?
If I recall, I think it happened very quickly. Literally within 12 or 24 months, like 1 year or 2 years after, certainly before the end of the war.
Wrong.
Really?
Yes. It was less than a year. What?
Doesn't make any damn sense.
Know.
Well, they're celebrating the 6-month anniversary. That doesn't make any sense.
This is what happened. In the opening year of the First World War, various organisations formed in Australia to raise funds for Australian troops. In mid-1915, many of them went from merely seeking donations to organising fundraising days that combined patriotic displays with carnivals and so forth. Now, in mid-1915, the South Australian government decided to turn the upcoming Labour Day, which was the 13th of October, into a fundraising day, and Labour Day was a public holiday, and the organisers decided that it should be called Anzac Day as a way of raising money.
Is that right? The South Australians have done it again. They've gone first.
They've gone first.
Incredible.
And so what's that? 6 months.
In the intermission, Chris discussed the Anzacs' superbly executed evacuation of the Gallipoli Peninsula.
So anyway, as you know, the campaign went on for must be 9 months, up until December. And the decision to evacuate arose from a visit by Field Marshal Lord Kitchener, who was the Secretary for State of War at the time, and in mid-November 1915, he just popped along for a couple of hours, had a bit of a look at Anzac Cove, had a bit of a look at, the Turkish line, and said, this isn't going to work. I'm going to make a recommendation to the War Cabinet that we get everyone out of here. There was a big offensive back in August where they had a big push to try to take the Turkish positions and make some ground. It didn't work, and they simply just didn't have it in them, or the reserves in them, I should say, to have another crack. And I should say, Conan, I've been to Gallipoli, I've been to the battlefield, and what really struck me, well, perhaps two things. One was the terrain. It is incredibly rugged, but also incredibly beautiful, to be quite frank. An amazing location. And the second thing that really struck me is just how small the battlefield was. For example, in the movie Gallipoli, the one with Mel Gibson, where they do that big run at the end where they charge the Turkish lines. So that was the Battle of the Neck, and I've been to the Neck, and it's like 30 metres between the trenches. Really? So you imagine coming out of your trench and then just charging in a machine gun 30 metres away. I mean, my goodness, the slaughter that was occurring at close range was just horrific. It all came down to an Australian staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Brudnell White, and he had a cunning plan to gradually withdraw the men and their gear while convincing the Turks that everything was basically all okay, fighting as per normal.
Because a retreat is a very dangerous operation.
Absolutely.
In a military context. You're obviously very vulnerable. So
Absolutely, and the rattling of those machine guns while you're trying to get out to your boats, I mean, it'd be worse than the landing, because this time the Turks would be prepared in place and firing away.
And they would open up with the artillery and send in the infantry. As you're scuttling down the slopes, getting into boats, rowing madly.
So anyway, the British War Cabinet did make the decision on the 8th of December to get out. So as part of the Lieutenant Colonel's plan, it was really a process of deception. For a period, they ceased fire, which would be kind of normal in preparing for the winter months as they kind of dig in and do other sorts of things. And at the end of that period, they began irregular fire on the Turkish positions. And artillery fire, of course, was very much part of that. And I should say my grandfather, of course, would have been actually part of this manoeuvre. I'm very proud of that fact, for sure. And so anyway, continuing the sporadic fire and keeping the Turks thinking the Australians are still there, still firing, and still carrying out the operations as per normal.
And they were getting sort of used to the idea of lulls between barrages, weren't they?
That's exactly right. That's exactly
quite long,
right. So,
longer than usual lags between each barrage. Indeed.
Getting them used to a different cadence of battle, effectively. Exactly. So, during the nights, of course, they would move equipment off, but during the day, they would bring equipment back, non-essential equipment and other types of equipment, in order to give the Turks the impression that it was basically business as usual. There were sort of 3 stages in terms of the evacuation of
Did
the
it
Allies.
have a cool name like Operation Tortoise?
No, but probably should.
Yeah. It's a missed opportunity, because I don't think they were into that in the First World War as much as they were in the... I think
The Second World War was all about code names. The entire war
usually
was a
code
series
names
of...
that gave away exactly what the plan was, wherever possible.
So anyway, and they continued to trickle men and equipment out to make it look like they were preparing for winter, just having the minimum number of men to hold things whilst the conditions were no good for fighting. And so stage 2 was basically where they dropped the number of troops from 41,000 to 26,000. And I really love this bit. The final stage, on the 17th of December, just a couple of days before they evacuated, they actually held a cricket match. Famous cricket match at a place called Shell Green, and they played this while the Turkish were firing, overhead. And then on the 18th of December, at the end of the second stage, and then they withdrew the remainder of them over the next couple of days, and by the 20th of December 1915, they were gone.
In the 10th ep, I thrilled Chris with an account of the wreck of the Batavia, one of the most grim incidents in Australia's maritime history.
I'm excited because it is such a bizarre incident in its own right. It's pretty much the first time Europeans had any kind of meaningful contact with the Australian continent. It's sort of almost a proto-settlement, really, in a way. And it's also a Nazism in microcosm. So let me set the scene. 1629. Imagine, Chris, that you are a young merchant, you're an employee of the Dutch East Indies Company, you're aboard the Batavia, you've been 6 months at sea, you're not enjoying it, perhaps you've discovered you're seasick, and every day has been torture. I know you're not, because, as you like to remind us, you've sailed on a Dutch ship.
I have indeed. Yes, the replica Deutschen, of course. I think we may have mentioned that in a previous episode.
I think you did, at length. So you're a young merchant, you're in a tiny cabin, not much room, it's been an ordeal, and you're one of the lucky ones, at least you have a cabin. And you're trying to get to sleep, but you can't. It's the small hours of the morning, and the reason you can't get to sleep is because you're worried. You're worried because you're currently sailing due east in the roaring 40s. They're taking advantage of the trade winds, but you know that at some point, just before the Batavia gets to Australia, it's got to turn left.
Where is it on its way to?
That's a very good point. It just occurred to me that I hadn't mentioned that. It's on its way to its namesake, to Batavia, which is now Jakarta. So the Batavia has to turn left and then head due north. But the problem is the Batavia doesn't know its
longitude. And it's all very well to turn left, but the question is when?
Exactly. And that's playing on your mind. And so you eventually nod off to sleep, only to be woken by the splintering of wood, the crash of the ship as it plows into a reef. You're thrown from your bunk, screams, wails. You open the door, it's chaos, it's darkness. All you can hear are people screaming and the sound of water pouring in. You clamber up onto the deck. It's obviously complete darkness. The officers are trying to get command of the crew, but the crew refuse to listen because they assume that they're doomed, because they can't swim. They're somewhere in the Indian Ocean. They don't know where. Death seems imminent. They're trying to find the grog so they can get smashed.
Blatant panicking.
Yes, and this carries on for several hours, and during which time about 100 people die of the 330. But when dawn breaks, you rejoice because what you see around you is not empty ocean, but an archipelago of low-lying, scrubby, sandy islands, which suggests salvation of sorts.
Or suggests the thing that they hit the night, I suspect.
Yes, well, you hit a reef. And the Batavia is gently sinking. It's certainly doomed, but it hasn't sunk yet. And there's an opportunity, therefore, to evacuate to these islands. What you don't realise is that the nightmare has only just begun. Batavia was by no means alone, as in the ship, was by no means alone in smacking into Western Australia. Happened all the time, because they couldn't determine longitude, and it relied on the dead reckoning of the skipper. So there are wrecks up and down the West Australian coast, and particularly around where the Batavia was wrecked, which is called the Houtman Arrojos Islands. So that's why the Batavia was there. And the people aboard comprised, there were about 150 crew, there were 100 mercenaries as well that were going to replenish the VOC's troops up in Batavia, and there were quite a few passengers as well, including merchants.
I would recommend anyone go to the Maritime Museum in Fremantle and see the size of this thing. Nowhere near as big as you could imagine.
No. And they built a replica of it as well. You can see that in the Netherlands. It's probably bigger than the Doifken. It was a big vessel for the time, but yeah. And this is the thing. I mean, it's very hard for us now to really understand why you would do this to yourself. Why you would go to Batavia.
It'd be frightening. The whole thing would
Every aspect of it would be bad. Because
cash.
It's clearly just cash, but there's no absolute guarantee you're going to make money there, right? But there's a decent chance, and I guess you would be set up for life potentially. But the problem was that the journey, as I said, was up to 8 months. There's a decent chance you could die of dysentery or scurvy, typhus, pleurisy, pneumonia en route, or the ship could be wrecked in a storm or on the West Australian coast or somewhere else. Even in the late 18th century, the death rate could be as high as 45%.
45% attrition just through disease and health issues on board.
Yeah.
That is
And that's
extraordinary.
just one voyage. Once you're in Batavia, you stood a 1 in 4 chance of dying from malaria within the first year.
Yeah,
And then you've got to make the journey back. Cornelius felt he was pretty safe from them. It was at this point that he began instigating a drawn-out massacre.
So he's gotten rid of the threats.
Yep.
And now he can carry on as he pleases.
Yes, that's right. He began by ordering his men to slaughter the entire population of one of the nearby islands, right? Just kill them in one go. Get it done.
I wonder if the people on the main island saw this happening. I presume the islands were within visual distance.
Look, I can't actually answer that.
They would have heard guns. They would have heard all sorts
Well, he didn't
of
use
stuff.
guns. He didn't need to because they were unarmed.
That's nasty.
So
yes.
he did actually have 2 muskets, or primitive pre-musket firearms, but he was saving them for when the rescue ship arrived. He was keeping his powder dry. So over the next few weeks, the killing continued on the main island itself. The strongest were killed at night, the throats cut. Others were taken out on rafts and drowned. The sick and lame were targeted, children too, because there were unfortunately kids. There was a missionary whose entire family were killed. He had 5 kids, I think, while he dined with Cornelius. So Cornelius was being friendly and charming, invited him around for dinner. His men killed his entire family while he was out.
I just don't know how the population on the main island didn't realise, well, maybe we should revolt.
Well, they didn't have the weapons and they were terrified. And he was also making it clear that you could survive, but to do so, you had to kill other people.
I
So
see.
they-
So you kill that person, I'll keep you alive.
Yeah, so there was always an element of hope. So that's kind of why it's so diabolical, but often they would just be killed anyway.
In the intermission, Chris went into how the problem of determining longitude was solved.
Clearly, the inability to measure longitude, of course, didn't just lead to the wreck of the Batavia, led to many, many wrecks. And of course, increasingly, European economies were more reliant on merchant shipping. And so this was becoming a real problem. The French government established a science academy in 1666 to really focus on this problem. And of course, in the meantime, ships were continuing to use dead reckoning. It was prone to mistakes, prone to inaccuracies, and often led to disaster. And in fact, there was a famous disaster in 1707. Admiral Sir Cloudesley Chauvel was travelling from Gibraltar towards the English Channel, poor visibility. They incorrectly measured their longitude via dead reckoning. They did it very poorly. And 4 of the 5 ships crashed and sank, killed 2,000 troops, and the murder of the very admiral himself by a local woman after he washed ashore. One of the biggest shipwrecks in British history, and British government instituted the Longitude Act of 1714, which I think is fantastic, which included a cash prize for anyone to find a solution to the problem of longitude. It was very difficult to measure time on a ship.
In the 11th ep, I looked at First Nations author, activist and inventor David Unipon.
Now, Chris, I'm going to hold up to the microphone, as Philip Adams is so fond of saying on Late Night Live, a $50 note, which very few people use now because everyone's electronic. But as you can see, Chris, so I'm just rustling it to the microphone. We've got Edith Cowan on one side, who we've already talked about, and on the other side we have David Unipon. I wanted to talk about him because he was quite an extraordinary man. He was an inventor, he was a great writer, an orator, preacher, and an activist. And he lived into his 90s, which is remarkable given that he was born in the late 19th century.
Wow.
And Aboriginal. given that he lived so long, it gives us a sort of insight into what it was like for Aboriginal people in Australia over such a long period of time. The policy of assimilation governed the lives of Aboriginal people from the 30s to the 60s. Under these policies, Aboriginal people were expected to live like white people, adopting European cultural practices and language. And of course, it was during this period too that we saw the policies of the stolen generations. So the rate of forced removal of Indigenous children from their families increased because the perception was that full-blood Aboriginal people, and that's a term that was used at the time, it's certainly not acceptable now, they would die out. But what you could do is take the children of, remember, it wasn't the children of so-called full-blood Aboriginal people that were taken. It was only those where white parentage was involved, because it was believed that you could take the children, train them up as domestics, and then you could breed out the Aboriginal blood over a few generations. This is why it's been described as a form of genocide, because you are deliberately seeking to eradicate the race. So there was a way you could get out of being treated as contemptibly as this. You could, in effect, quote unquote, cease to be Aboriginal and get documents demonstrating that. So it was called exemption. Any person holding a certificate of exemption had to live under certain rules. You had to live like a white person, whatever that means. You had to display exemplary behaviour, again, whatever that means. Ceasing all contact with non-exempt Aborigines, other than immediate family, and you had to carry your certificate with you at all times.
So basically, it's kind of voluntary assimilation, effectively. Okay.
Yeah. So, but it meant that you had a few more freedoms. You could move around a bit more. You had control over how you spent your money. These kinds of things. So you weren't, infantilized, in effect. And it enabled you to drink alcohol and the right to own land, that kind of thing. It'd
be interesting to know how those people were received in the broader society at the time. As well.
No, not fantastically well.
I suspect so.
I actually don't know to what extent that was taken up. It would be interesting to know. Anyway, look, we've diverted, we've tangented, if that's a word, which it isn't. Let's get back to Unipon. In 1909, because as I said, he was an inventor. Again, Chris, I'm going to hold up the $50 bill, and we can see...
You mind doing that Russell thing again?
Anyone at home, if they have a $50 note, they can have a look at it. And just to the right of Unipon's portrait is the schematic of a device. Any idea what that is, Chris?
Looks like a shearer.
You're correct.
Am I right? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was a mechanized sheep shearing handpiece, which he patented. But what I didn't realise, I don't know if this is still true, but it's relatively affordable to sort of get a provisional patent on something, but to cement that patent, if you like, in your name, you have to then spend more, which he didn't have. So he patented, depending on the source, I've heard 19 devices over the course of his life. He took out several patents, but he wasn't able to afford to take out full patents on any of them, so they lapsed and other people took his ideas in some cases. As I say, he was involved in activism, but it's interesting to look at his particular approach. So he was completely convinced that Aboriginal people and white people were fundamentally equal, intrinsically the same, which was a view that was at odds with that of many white people. So he believed that Aboriginal people should be given the chance to become part of the modern world, but on their own terms rather than through the assimilation policies. And it speaks in some ways to his upbringing by sympathetic white people, as well as a certain pragmatism. So this is a quote from him. "The coming of the white man was in itself a blessing. We were isolated from the world's culture. It is true that my people could not adapt themselves to civilization, but that is because it came too suddenly for us." So he believes that rather than through the forced assimilation process, there should be this sort of less paternalistic, gradual process by which Aboriginal people can become part of so-called civilization. By the 1920s, he was the most well-known Aboriginal person in Australia. Because of his great oratorical skills, he was a great public speaker. He was in demand all throughout Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide. But that doesn't mean he wasn't without passion and anger for what was going on. This is what he wrote in 1934. "My fellow Australians with white skins, I belong to a race in whose welfare you have lately been taking an unusually acute interest. I do not question the genuineness of your motives. Your sincerity is undoubted. But when I read your newspapers and the opinions of your politicians, missionaries and scientists, I am saddened and astonished at your ignorance of our problems. It is not us, it seems, who are most in need of enlightenment. You appear to know no more about us than if we were Tierra del Fuegans. So, and in 1995, he was immortalised on our $50 note, and of course he's still there. So, Chris, that brings us to the end of Unipon. Key learnings for you?
Indeed. Look, I actually think it was, I learned obviously a huge amount about someone who I recognised but didn't really know. Someone who lived for so long and saw so much change from the late 1800s through to the 1960s, kind of played a role in those changes in many ways, or at least an intellectual role in those changes. But then this guy's a polymath. He has so many other aspects to him, the music, the inventions and so on. I just think that's really quite extraordinary. Yeah, and what I think is also very interesting, he tried really hard, probably due to his upbringing, to bridge European or white society, if you like, with Aboriginal society. Whilst his ideas may be controversial from a modern perspective, he intellectualized it the best he could. So I think, good on him. What a remarkable person.
In the intermission, Chris discussed the invention of the Hills hoist.
It was a very clever Australian. There was a blacksmith from Geelong called Gilbert Toyne. He was the hoist pioneer.
Right.
Okay, he's the guy that really kind of kicked things off here in Australia. And he, along with a friend called Lambert Downey, launched the Aeroplane Clothes Hoist Company at the Melbourne's 1911 Agricultural Show. And why was it called the Aeroplane Clothes Hoist Company Conan?
Oh, yes. Was it connected to aeroplane jelly, or indeed?
I'd like to say so, but you know why? Because it sounded cool.
Oh, right.
It's in the same way that products these days want to connect their product with the space program.
Oh, sure.
Some of their early designs were very clumsy, various ratcheting mechanisms, various counterweights. The whole thing was just an ugly mess. But that said, he managed to sell his hoists. What they did prove to be relatively popular, and he promoted them both as a labour-saving device. But what was quite interesting, it was also a device to avoid you catching diseases when you walk through wet grass. This is how it was promoted, because if you had your hoist down this nice little paved concrete area, so you can stand in one spot, and you can swing the clothesline around. You hang your clothes up, you can hoist it up.
Yeah.
And of course, you don't have to step off the concrete.
You don't, because
disease.
I'm always catching diseases from my lawn.
100%.
That's why I never set foot on it.
That's right.
The reason I don't go onto the lawn is now because we have 2 dogs and the lawn is unusable.
I would suggest barely a lawn at all anymore.
Yeah. It looks like the Somme, Chris. It looks like the Somme. Holes everywhere, excrement. The only way in which it differs from the Somme is the amount of clothing. The dogs will drag clothing from inside the house, chew it up all over the garden, and leave the remnants there amongst the excreta and the various trenches and holes they've dug.
Anyway, so his company only lasted a few years, and the reason was World War I came along, and Toyne basically headed off to fight. And this guy, if he didn't have bad luck, he wouldn't have had any luck at all. He was gassed, of course, in Europe, only to return to Australia to find his wife had left him with the company manager. So it's, but he kept going. That's the sort of guy he was. He kept at it, and he kept finessing his raising mechanism, because it was pretty ugly still. And in 1926, he pretty much came up with the design that we still use today for that rotary hoist. I might just touch on, it's perhaps a less exciting invention, but a really important invention. And strangely enough, this has, we'll call it an indirect link to the Hills hoist. And that's cask wine.
I was hoping you would be touching on the Goon of Fortune.
We're going there. I'm going to tie these together.
Because it's one of your favourite hobbies, isn't it?
It is.
So, Chris, perhaps we should just explain for our overseas listener what a goon is. And we should also clarify that we have checked, and it is not a racist slur. It's from flagon, as in flagoon.
So the cask wine, or the bag in the box, I suppose, was actually invented in Renmark by Tom Angove of Angove's Wine, of course. And they sold this wine in cartons, about 4.5 litres. And the reason why he came up with this concept was because, you'd open a bottle of wine, you've got to finish it.
Yeah.
The wine goes off if you leave it open and so on. So, because of efficiency reasons, it makes so much sense. You've got this kind of tap. It doesn't allow air into it. You continue to use it when you want. It was patented in 1965, so it's been around for a very long time. And it really became the very first company to sell wine in a box. Interestingly, how snobbish Penfolds is, of course. Penfolds, the wine of choice. I do love Penfolds, by the way. Anyone who drinks Penfolds, delicious wine. But they followed...
They're not going to send you any wine.
Well,
they're going to send you some Grange.
No one from... Please send me some Grange for this podcast. I love you. Penfolds, of course, followed fairly soon. They had a bag, but not in a box, of course. You don't want to be like Ango's. Bag in a tin. And it was called the table cask. Fundamentally, it allowed us just to have a couple of glasses without having to get completely sloshed by drinking the rest of the wine, which is a big mistake if you buy it in a 2.5 litre flagon.
And it's magnificent for the Goon of Fortune, which, as one of Canberra's leading proponents, Chris, you should explain what...
The Goon of Fortune. Okay, indeed. And this is a shout out to the inventors of the Goon of Fortune, which are students everywhere since about 1965, when the Hills Hoist was in its peak, of course, as was cask wine. So, this cask wine does tend to be reasonably priced for a whole range of reasons, which makes it absolutely ideal for students to purchase. And so what the Goon of Fortune is, you pick a single bladder, or goon, if you like, the bag, to the Hills Hoist. You have a bunch of your friends stand around, and then you spin the clothesline, and wherever it stops, you need to take a drink.
Yeah.
That's it. It's as simple as that.
Until the inevitable.
Sheer student genius. Good on
and
you.
It's actually, Sunday night at our place is Goon of Fortune, so helps the kids sleep. It's fantastic.
In the 12th ep, I blew Chris's mind as I told tale of Harold Florey, who was one of 3 people responsible for the development of penicillin.
So in the end, there were many, many rooms in this laboratory where they were working just full these sort of hidden, these containers containing the
Where was this,
mold.
by the way? Oxford University, thank you. Yeah.
But, they weren't producing the output necessary. So they conducted tests on mice, and this was actually the exciting moment where they realised that it was actually working. They were deliberately, of course, infecting mice with bacterial infections. And then they were treating the mice with small quantities of penicillin, and there was a particular point where they realised, my God, this actually works. This isn't just theoretical, this is working.
The mice weren't keeling over, they weren't...
They were responding to treatment.
Wow.
The first human being on whom they tested it was a 43-year-old policeman who had scratched his cheek while pruning roses and had developed septicemia.
My God!
So this is...
Jeepers.
It's hard to believe, isn't it?
It is hard to believe. Scratched his cheek on a rose thorn or something like that, and keeling over because of it. Potentially.
And he was in a sepsis ward. I've seen a documentary with Michael Mosley did a series where he was looking at this, and there were photos or film of this poor man. He looked appalling. It's very hard to describe just what sepsis can do to a human being.
I think that example in itself really kind of drive home to anyone listening to this, and certainly to me, how incredibly...
How precious. Antibiotics are.
Yeah,
really.
Incredible. For sure.
So what happened was they gave him some penicillin, and they found to their delight, and no doubt his, that he was responding to it. He began to feel quite a bit better. But the problem was they didn't have enough. And what they had also discovered was that the body excretes penicillin very, very quickly, within a few hours, and it comes out through the urine. So what they had to do was extract from his urine the penicillin and then re-inject him in the hope of, because they weren't producing enough. And within a relatively short period of time, he relapsed, and unfortunately he died.
The only silver lining there is they realised then that it was going to work in human beings very clearly.
Yes.
They needed to recover fully.
That
that completely makes sense.
You need a full recovery just to demonstrate it. Yes, so this was during the Second World War. They still hadn't developed a technique for developing enough penicillin ahead of D-Day, which, as I said before, was the deadline. So when war was declared in 1939, the Oxford team weren't able to get enough support to begin large-scale manufacture and testing in Britain, despite the obvious potential for the drug.
Not when there's perfectly good tanks to make and other things, I guess.
Yeah, and I don't know whether this was just the failure of the British authorities to recognise the potential in it, or whether it was simply they just didn't have the money. Because obviously Britain was just on its last legs financially. The war was crippling it. It didn't really have the resources to throw this. So instead, the team under Florey went to the American government, and it was the US who agreed to begin producing penicillin at a laboratory in Illinois. They also conducted further research looking at new strains that would provide higher outputs and make enough of the drug available for Allied troops ahead of D-Day.
You know, it's interesting. Like how many times have we mentioned in our podcast that so-and-so went to the US in order to make this thing on a mass scale?
To
industrialise, to commercialise, and so on. I mean, this is very specific.
Yes,
and there's good reason why it's the case.
And getting back to overrated Christopher Nolan, this connects with the Manhattan Project indirectly, in the sense that America had the resources for the Manhattan Project. It had the resources for things like developing penicillin. It had the industrial might behind it that made it possible for it to prevail against Germany and Japan. And for that matter, you know, things like the bomber from which the atom bomb was dropped, the
Enola Gay.
Enola Gay, so not the specific bomber, but the kind of bomber, the super fortress. That was a colossally expensive project. Designing and building those on the sort of scale that could obliterate Japan. Building that type of bomber alone cost more than the Manhattan Project.
Really?
Yeah.
Building the planes costs more than building the bomb.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it?
That is extraordinary. Yeah.
So America just had this sort of remarkable amount of money at its disposal.
In the intermission, Chris disgusted me by talking about old-fashioned medical treatments.
Okay, enemas. Smoke enemas were a big thing. It was considered to be a treatment for cholera. A smoke enema, essentially what they did was they would boil up tobacco-infused water, and they would just administer...
Oh, so it's liquid.
Administer it as a liquid, that's right. And the suggestion was that, you know, hundreds of lives have been saved by this. Clearly, it's a load of bollocks, and I doubt very much it saved any at all. But enemas were...
But it took your mind off the cholera.
It certainly did take your mind off the cholera. But... You know, for the last few hundred years, well, certainly until the beginning of last century, enemas were well known as something that was therapeutic. At least that was the idea. They would mix herbs and so on in the enema. It would cure things like constipation, fair enough. But, you know, like so many medicines, they start designed to cure one thing, and then suddenly they're curing everything that ails you.
They get overexcited.
100%. And so they did this for, you know, obviously they did this for a long time. It was very popular in high society back in the 1700s, 1600s and so on. People had multiple enemas a day, right? Those that could afford it. And indeed, Louis XIV of France is said to have had more than 2,000 enemas in his lifetime.
And I saw an episode of QI that bellows were provided on the banks of the Thames for people who, if you wanted to save someone from drowning, and you drag them out of the water, and if they're not breathing, then you stick bellows up their bum and literally blows smoke up their arse as a way of reviving them.
And how many were revived in that fashion?
Well, it'd be interesting. I mean, again, I think it would, if you were in any way likely to regain consciousness, having that done to you would certainly rouse you into an alert state.
In the 13th ep, I held forth on great Aussie aviator Charles Kingsford Smith, much to the delight of Chris, who's a budding pilot.
The difficulties posed by the Trans-Pacific flight were so significant it was widely thought to be impossible. Firstly, no plane existed that had the range. Secondly, aerial navigation was in its infancy, a critical issue when flying over the sea. So they planned to complete the crossing in 3 very long hops, from California to Hawaii, Hawaii to Fiji, and Fiji to Brisbane.
I actually knew that. I did indeed.
Oh, okay. But you say that, but there's no way of knowing now.
No, that's too late.
Yeah. Now, were they to miss Hawaii or Fiji, they would simply run out of fuel, crash and die. So Smithy went to America and bought a 3-engined Fokker monoplane in Seattle, which he named the Southern Cross. He made room for multiple fuel tanks. And Smithy and Orme faced a series of financial and regulatory hurdles, which were overcome with generous support from the New South Wales government, as well as wealthy individuals in Australia and the US. And they hired 2 Americans. So interestingly, the navigator and the radio operator were not Australians. Because they were coming from America to Australia, I guess it just made sense to find local talent. Those men were Harry Lyon and James Warner. And Ulm forced both of them to sign a contract that denied them a meaningful share of any riches that might come from them. Yeah.
That's outrageous. I had no idea. That's actually outrageous.
Because these guys were sharing the risks equally.
They could die.
Yeah.
At the same time as everybody else. By the way, as the navigator,
yeah,
in that position, I'd wait till they were halfway to Y, and then I'd start my negotiation
yes,
on my contract.
Right. Yeah. So on 31st of May 1928, they took off from Oakland Airfield, just near San Francisco. And to lighten the load, they all sat on wicker chairs that were not even bolted to the floor. And they obviously didn't have seatbelts either. There'd be no point. Attached
Can
to
you imagine
a wicker chair
bouncing around inside the aircraft, strapped to a wicker chair?
And at altitude, the cabin and cockpit were freezing, as the fuselage was basically made of thin fabric. And this was a particular issue for Lyon and Warner in the back, because they'd failed to bring warm clothing. Not quite sure why that wasn't.
They didn't read the memo?
They didn't read the memo. And the noise of the engines was deafening too, so that Lyon and Warner could only communicate with the pilots by writing on scraps of paper, which they would then pass to the pilots on the end of a stick. And that was necessary because there was a massive fuel tank between the guys at the back and the pilots.
My goodness.
And there was no toilet, of course, either. So
they have like the heads like in some of those old-fashioned, ships of the line, straight over the side. That'd be cold.
I don't think it was even that. I think they just had to make up their own arrangements. And in fact, we get to that. I'm not sure what I would say under those circumstances. I think I'd moan. I'd just whinge. Because that's what I do on normal flights across the Pacific. Now,
and that's flying it's flying on a modern airline.
Yeah, if I'm in economy class, which I always am, really.
You're sitting there eating your chow mein or your beef stroganoff.
Yeah.
And you're complaining.
I'm complaining. Everything's bad. Everything's wrong. The child is crying nearby, either my own or someone else's. I was flying the other day on a certain airline I won't mention, and the pilot came over the PA. He sounded like he had just been knocking it back ever since he took off. But it didn't matter because I was watching Cocaine Bear on the entertainment system.
Cocaine Bear, that's an actual movie.
Yeah, you've not heard of Cocaine Bear?
I have. I've seen it actually on a plane. I didn't watch the movie. I flipped through it and I go, that can't be real.
It's not only real, it is outstanding.
And is it a bear that snorts cocaine?
Yes.
Oh, for the love of God. It's insane.
It's an instant cult classic, and I would encourage you to get into it. It's probably on Netflix. No, definitely watch it. Very funny.
I'll be looking out for that next.
It even has an aviation element in it, Chris.
What?
It starts on a plane. This guy, it's filled with cocaine. He's the pilot. He decides he's going to dump a whole bunch of cocaine out for reasons that are not particularly clear. But he's also high himself on cocaine. So it's very well performed, that scene. Every scene is well performed. It's a masterpiece.
I'll put that on the list.
You don't believe me?
No. No, I don't.
This is really disappointing. I just don't feel I can progress in this podcast until you agree to watch the first 10 minutes of Cocaine Bear.
Okay. So
will you do that for me?
I agree that I will watch the first, even 15 minutes of Cocaine Bear. But we should get back to the crossing of the Pacific. And if I could just recap for the listeners. So we've got Charles Kingsford Smith, his friend Charles Ulm, the two guys that I can't remember because they have no fame or status.
Yeah, that's right. They're just Americans.
And a cargo load full of cocaine flying across the Pacific with a bear. So
that's right.
Take it from there.
That'd be fantastic to conflate these. If only there was a biopic made about with Elizabeth Banks, the American actor who directed Cocaine Bear. We could get her to do a biopic of Kingsford Smith. That's exactly what would happen. In the intermission, Chris looked at a bizarre episode that took place over Bass Strait during the 1970s.
I want to tell you the story of a pilot called Fred Valentik, who disappeared under mysterious circumstances over Bass Strait in 1978. Have you heard of Fred?
I don't think so.
Okay, great. Well, let me give you a bit of a synopsis. So he was a young pilot. He'd hired a Cessna 182L light aircraft. He sort of rented this thing on October the 21st, 1978, on his way to King Island to pick up some friends, apparently. So he left Moorabbin Airport and he's going to return to Moorabbin. So during
Where the hell's Moorabbin?
That's Melbourne, basically.
Oh, right.
During this flight, it was about 130 miles, so it's not nautical miles. It's not that far. Valentik, or Fred, he advised air traffic control that he was being accompanied by an aircraft about 1,000 feet above him. He described unusual actions and strange sort of characteristics. Then he reported that his engine had begun running roughly, then finally reported, before disappearing from the radar, that the strange aircraft is hovering on top of me.
Oh.
It is hovering, and it's not an aircraft.
Oh.
Fascinating.
Those were his words.
They were his words, absolutely. Back to ATC. No trace of Frederick or his aircraft was ever found, and a government investigation concluded that the reason for the disappearance could not be determined, but they presumed it was fatal. And 5 years after, an engine cowl, so the sort of bonnet, if you like, was found washed ashore on Flinders Island. It came from an aircraft of similar kind of era, similar type that he was flying at the time. Clearly this stirred up a lot of UFO interest, both in Australia and around the world.
In the 14th ep, I discussed Miles Franklin, one of Australia's first female authors.
Miles Franklin. Why? Why are we doing Miles Franklin? Because she was a literary pioneer, of course, not only as a woman writing, but because she was also a trailblazer as an Australian author generally. She was writing around the time of Federation, as Australia created itself, and she was writing in a very Australian way, in a very Australian setting.
Yeah, absolutely. A bit of a game changer, really. And of course, we have the award named after her.
Now, so the first 10 years of her life were pretty carefree. She was living in quite affluent surroundings, either at Old Taubingo or on her parents' farm in the Monaro, where she was educated by a private tutor. But when her family were forced to move to a small drought-ridden dairy farm near Goulburn, life became more difficult and her education suffered. And she was sort of forced to do, a lot of labour on the farm itself.
A lot of dairy-related activities.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think, it was pretty hard yakka. But nonetheless, she read voraciously. And during that time, she wrote My Brilliant Career when she was only 19.
Is that right?
Yeah. Like all first novels, it's semi-autobiographical.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's really very similar to her life. And so when she says it was my brilliant career, that's an ironic reference. And she wrote it in basically 6 months, mostly in the evenings, after her many farm chores were complete. So,
Brilliant. I mean, that's pretty tough work.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You're out there all day slogging it out and, heavy physical labour and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Then to actually have the energy.
Rounding up heifers and whatnot.
100%. Have the energy to sit down and pen your novel. I mean, that's just brilliant.
I've been in a position where I was wooing a young lady who lived on a farm in the central west, New South Wales. And her brothers thought it would be amusing to encourage me to jump into a pen full of sheep. And they said, "Mate, just grab a sheep for us, will you?" And I thought this could be a unique experience. And
there's no way they'd be doing it to make you look like a goose.
Exactly. They found it very funny because it was just a sea of sheep. They were all sort of corralled into this pen, and I jumped in. I thought, you just grab them right. You just rugby tackle them, don't you? And then I was just sort of doing various tackles, lunging around the place. I was just covered in dirt and sheep crap. I wasn't getting any sheep.
And the purpose of wrestling that sheep, did they explain that?
No, they might have. It was a while ago. They might have said we need it for jumbucking or for whatever it is.
There was a tucker bag sitting nearby. They needed something done with
that. They might have deployed farm
Yeah.
speak, bamboozled me. We got it. So I said, sure. When in Rome. But I didn't succeed and they laughed. But also, I think it helped break the ice a bit because they thought, well, he's clearly an idiot, but he's prepared to get his hands dirty. But the book was the literary event of 1901. As such, it opened many doors for her. She travelled to Sydney, where she met the poets Banjo Patterson and Joseph Furphy. And she also met Rose Scott, who is a social reformer in Sydney, as well as Vida Goldstein, a Melbourne feminist. So she was mixing in these circles. Now, this is what a literary critic in the Bulletin wrote of My Brilliant Career, it is the very first Australian novel to be published. Her book is a warm embodiment of Australian life, as tonic as bush air, as aromatic as bush trees, and as clear and honest as bush sunlight. That's nice.
That's very uplifting, I think. Brilliant.
And the timing of it was crucial, because as the book so powerfully resonated with an Australia growing more confident in its identity, it chimed, I guess, with Australians broadly and with young female Australians.
Yeah, no, I think that's great.
Though it's very much a first novel, My Brilliant Career is, as I said, it's consistently well written, it's compelling, it's passionate, and it's very readable. It also captures the very specific vernacular and mood of rural Australian life at the time. And she received many letters from young women who were in a similar situation to her, all aching for a form of freedom that had been denied to them. So this is a quote from My Brilliant Career. It came home to me as a great blow that it was only men who could take the world by its ears and conquer their fate, while women, metaphorically speaking, were forced to sit with tied hands and patiently suffer as the waves of fate tossed them hither and thither, battering and bruising without mercy.
In the intermission, Chris examined the Ern Malley affair, one of the 20th century's greatest literary hoaxes.
Harris wrote as an introduction to the edition outlining Malley's short life and untimely death as described by his sister in the letter. And he wrote in that introduction, I am firmly convinced that this unknown mechanic and insurance peddler is one of the most outstanding poets that we have produced here in this country. It was quite a splash. It was big news in the poetry scene because this stuff was really pushing the boundaries. But kind of within a couple of weeks, it emerged that Ern Malley wasn't real. Suspicion arose because Harris and Reid were aware of people trying to make them look a little foolish, particularly those from the conservative side, I suppose, those that weren't necessarily fond of modernist poetry. And indeed, he was accused by others within academia of actually writing the poems himself. Harris was, absolutely. And then suddenly the press got onto this, right? And so the press were involved. They were looking for Banksy here, right? Yeah. They'd identified literature professor and crime writer Michael Innes as the author of the poems. And even student bookmakers started offering odds on the poet's true identity, which I think is quite funny. Ultimately, they traced back via the address that was provided by Ethel to identify who was actually the author of the poem. And as it turns out, it was traced back to the residence of a Sydney poet called Harold Stewart. Within a few days of that, Stewart and his fellow poet James Macaulay came clean. They released a statement admitting they were all behind the hoax. And they were really out to make a point. It's quite cruel, really. Quite cruel, but kind of funny on many other levels. But Macaulay and Stewart are both from ex-military. They said in their statement they believed modernist poetry to be humorless nonsense. And they produced the whole of Ern Malley's tragic life work in one afternoon with the aid of a chance collection of books which happened to be on their desk at the time, which included a concise Oxford dictionary, the collected works of Shakespeare, and a dictionary of quotations. They were out deliberately to devalue modernist poetry. That was all they were trying to do. Their view was modernist poetry was just a really, really bad literary experiment.
In the 15th ep, I looked at how the Australian flag and Australian citizenship came into being.
The war had demonstrated that we needed more people. It's a big country. There were only a few million of us. We needed immigrants. The problem was we had the White Australia policy and Australians were super racist. So what do you do? Have you heard the term beautiful bolts?
No, that's a new one for me.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So they thought. So obviously they were getting the £10 POM scheme. They were getting a lot of Brits who were obviously seeking a better life for themselves. In the 40s, in the post-war Britain, you can imagine how many people were quite desperate to get out of there. But even so, there weren't enough Brits and Irish coming over, so they had to expand immigration. But because of the racism, Caldwell realised he had to get people who were as white as they could possibly be. So the Baltic states were targeted. Immigration officials over there would invite people to immigrate to Australia, and they would select those who were the the best looking.
No, come on, no bollocks.
Yes,
that's
true.
rubbish.
It's true.
That's
and there was a massive.
Cannot believe.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just such a subjective.
Well,
it's so silly.
It is.
It's just so incredibly silly.
It's insane. But you've got to remember how insular we were, how parochial. So you've got to gently phase in immigration. So you start with attractive-looking Balts who are completely Northern European whites, and then they introduce the Greeks and Italians after that. Anyway, so prior to 1949, there was no such thing as an Australian citizen. So we'd been federated for nearly half a century, and everyone was British.
I didn't realise that.
Yeah, not many people do, which is why we're talking about this.
My goodness. Okay. No, that's... Yeah,
it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. That's what I mean. Federation was not about independence. Before that, anyone born or naturalised in Australia was a British subject. If travelling overseas, people were issued with British passports. But in the lead up to Federation, the Melbourne Herald newspaper and a journal called the Review of Reviews for Australasia, that's quite a mouthful, held competitions to design a flag for the new quasi-independent nation. However, these competitions were then folded into one run by the federal government after Federation, and that offered more prize money. The competition stipulated it wanted designs for two flags, one for official use and one to be used by merchant ships registered in Australia. So as I said, 33,000 submissions poured in. The results were announced on 3rd of September 1901 at the Melbourne Exhibition Building, where many of these submissions were on display. There was £200 prize money.
That's huge money for the time.
That's,
absolutely.
It's worth submitting stuff.
I'd love to see if there's some Bodie McBoatface. Like, did people back in that time have a similar sense of humour?
It's a good question.
I'd love to know.
Yeah. You could have, there must have been some silly submissions out of that 33,000. Intended or otherwise, I would say. So in the end, 5 people basically came up with the same design. And so the 200 quid was divided between them. And it was called at the time the Blue Ensign. And the one that was used for merchant ships, which was really just the same, but on a red background, was called the Red Ensign. Most of the other submissions also had a Union Jack in the canton. Now, the Flags Act. The Menzies government introduced this legislation to encourage people to use the Blue Ensign instead of the Union Jack and the Red Ensign, and that the latter should only be used on merchant ships, because people were using the Red Ensign sort of interchangeably with the Blue Ensign and the Union Jack.
Now, the Red Ensign, interestingly, was hijacked by the conspiracy folk just a few years ago, the anti-vax groups here during the COVID pandemic. We had rallies here in Canberra, if I recall, where people were running around and trying to storm, driving around Parliament House and doing all the sort of things that they do and beeping and carrying on with the Red Ensign flag, I think upside down, hanging out the window of their car and things like that, as a sign of this protest movement. Interesting.
I didn't know that, yeah. The bill was passed in December 1953 and given royal assent on Valentine's Day the following year by the Queen, who happened to be visiting at the time. The flag has been barely changed since the 1901 competition, though in 1908, when Australia acquired Papua as an external territory, that was when the 7th point was added to the Federation Star. In the intermission, Chris explained what happened when the Kiwis tried to change their flag.
Look, I'm just going to make a recommendation that to the listeners to go and have a look at the Sicilian flag. It looks a little bit like the Isle of Man flag, kind of a strange head appearing out of 3 legs on the flag. It's just fascinating. A Triskelion.
I don't mean to offend any Sicilian or Manx people listening to this, but I don't think it's a coincidence that 2 islands have 3-legged flags, because I associate islands with inbreeding. I haven't been to Sicily. I have been to the Isle of Man, Chris, and inbreeding is very much in evidence.
We don't have many listeners at the Isle of Man, do we?
No, we are. I assume we don't. Famously the cats there, the Manx cat is tailless.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. And if there was ever an example of,
and that is due to inbreeding. It is not deliberate. They have not deliberately bred them without tails. They just
lost its tail when
due to
brother and sister get together.
Yeah, and we saw people outside of the main town of Douglas. Not many people know the capital of the Isle of Man, Chris. I do. And now the listeners do as well. You go out into the countryside and you go, oh, that person doesn't look right.
And a series of referenda were held where New Zealand's got to choose a new flag.
So what kicked that off?
Well, what kicked it off was Prime Minister John Key. He floated the idea of a referendum ahead of the 2014 election.
Is he the one that likes putting the ponytails of women and girls?
That's a very good question.
I think
It could be.
I think he was.
He was conservative.
Yeah.
10 years ago.
Yeah, there's it's worth YouTubing.
Oh, no, really? Is that a real thing? I remember reading that somewhere.
He was just this video footage of like a girl talking to the camera next to him. It's at a press conference, and you can see his hand just sort of wander into frame, and he obviously just can't resist a ponytail, and he just gives it a bit of a quick yank. It's very weird. It's just, what are you doing, you insane man?
I think we're all going to be Googling that after this podcast. So anyway, it was a bit of an election ploy, right? So Prime Minister Key said, look, if we get elected for a third term in 2014, one of our promises is to hold a referendum on changing the flag, okay? I'd like to think there wasn't actually a lot of political capital in it. New Zealanders, similar to Australians, kind of don't care about a lot of this stuff. They think, we'd rather you focus on, for example, the housing crisis and the kind of things that are a bit more material versus things that, might...
Symbolic.
Yeah, symbolic. Yeah. Exactly. Anyway, they were voted back in and therefore they decided to proceed with the referendum. And what was interesting is, it almost goes back to some of the earlier comments. What do you think are the key reasons, the critical reasons why they needed to change their flag? Go on, hit us with it.
Is the real reason surprising?
The real reason is trivial.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh. Is it related to rugby?
No.
Because, not trivial to New Zealanders, very trivial to me. Separating making the flag different from that of Australia, that's not it, or Britain.
Oh, look, I actually think you're extremely close. In fact, probably on point here. Look, there's a range of reasons why. One of them, of course, is to remove the Union Jack. The Union Jack is a throwback to, obviously, its colonial origins, and of course doesn't recognise the Maoris. The Maori history doesn't recognise everyone else from everywhere else, of course, that forms part of New Zealand society. But the main reason put forward by the PM at the time was the sheer confusion between the Australian and New Zealand flags.
Right.
It happened time and time again where Prime Minister Key would turn up at an international event and be placed in front of an Australian flag, right? Which is absolutely hilarious. But it didn't just happen to the New Zealand folk. It's happened to Australians as well. Yeah. Maybe going back, I think it probably irks them a little bit more than it irks us, I suspect.
In the final ep, I looked at the 1789 smallpox epidemic that wiped out 70% of Sydney's Aboriginal population.
There is a reasonable possibility that they contracted it from what's called variolous matter. Now that is a primitive form of inoculation that the doctors on the First Fleet brought over. And basically what they are is just pustules that have been removed from the skin of recovering smallpox patients.
Okay, so it's the live virus, effectively.
Yes.
And small quantities.
Yeah, and that would be stored in vials of some kind, and then that's used as a primitive form, as a sort of inoculation. It would be used for any children born in the colony. The thing about variolous matter is that there's a reasonable chance that you will develop full-blown smallpox from it.
And die from the vaccination.
And die from the vaccination.
The early vaccinations were like that, don't they? If I remember from some of our earlier episodes.
Well, yes. I mean, the vaccination, we will talk a little bit about the proper vaccination, which came a bit later, or around the same time. And that was much safer. But what was called variolation, introducing pustules into an open wound as a primitive form of inoculation, was dangerous. But on balance, it was considered to be a better bet than running the risk of contracting smallpox. It was so widespread that there's a decent chance you're going to be exposed to smallpox, so it's better to run the risk. But still, obviously, not a great solution. Anyway, they brought the variolous matter over, these sort of disgusting pustules and glass vials. So that is certainly a conceivable way in which the Aboriginal people would have been exposed to the smallpox virus. But how did they get exposed to the variolous matter? Well, we don't know. But there is some suggestions that it was deliberately introduced to the Aboriginal people by officers of the First Fleet. Probably not Governor Phillip, because he was quite personally well disposed towards Aboriginal people, and he was under orders to treat them well. But it's possible that some of his officers would have taken matters into their own hands. They would have felt outnumbered. There were only, a few hundred Marines, and they were surrounded by Aboriginal people whom they held in contempt, of course. Importantly, they knew that smallpox could be used as a form of biological warfare. It had been used against Native Americans.
South America wiped out 90% of the population, not just smallpox, but that combination of diseases.
Yes, yeah. Although I think in many cases in South America it wasn't deliberate, but I think the British.
But it makes the case though for using it.
Yeah, but the British deliberately did it in North America, and they knew it worked.
Wow, God.
And so
horrendous.
Many of these officers would have known that, so they might have just seen introducing smallpox as a solution to what they perceived to be a problem. Now, that's one distinct possibility. And also, it might have been done by convicts. It might not have been done by officers. We don't know. I mean, we actually simply don't know. So assuming it was smallpox, colonists found cases of the disease as far north as the Hawkesbury River and as far south as Botany Bay. We don't know how many Aboriginal people died, not least because we don't know the population of the broader Sydney area at the time. But colonists at the time estimated that as many as 70% of the Aboriginal population, the Sydney region, died from the disease. This is what William Bradley, a Royal Navy officer and cartographer, said. "We did not see a canoe or a native the whole way coming up the harbour, and were told that scarce any had been seen lately, except laying dead in and about their habitations." So this would have been in 1789. And the effect of all of this was that it led to some Aboriginal people leaving the Sydney area, which had at least two effects. One, it may have spread the disease further inland. And second, it reduced the number of Aboriginal people who were able to resist European colonisation. So if it was introduced deliberately to reduce the threat posed by Aboriginal people, it worked. But unfortunately, what it means is that we might have to consider the very distinct possibility that one of the first things European colonists did when they arrived in Australia was an act of genocide. Something to think about.
Yeah, no, it's all very horrible. Conan?
Well, on that very unpleasant note, let's head into the intermission. In the intermission, Chris examined the Black Death and the Spanish flu.
I'm going to talk firstly about the Black Death, which we're all familiar with, of course. And so during the 14th century, the Black Death killed around a third of the population of Europe. So that's 25 million people. Wow. So when we sit around, as we have in the recent past, talking about the very, very high affliction rate of COVID-19, for example, it's kind of nothing compared to what we've experienced in the past, certainly, in medieval times and so on. The plague was where people first developed the concept of quarantine. And do you know what quarantine comes from, Conan?
Ooh, no. Oh, when are you going to quiz me?
I'd like to quiz you, but unfortunately I didn't construct my spiel in terms of quiz questions. Oh. So I'm just going to quiz you as we move through.
Oh, fine. Quarantine. Is it Latin? Something Latin for something?
Getting close.
Getting close? Okay. What does that mean?
Look,
Italian?
Indeed. Quarantina actually means 40 days. It's part of the Venetian language, so I'll give you some points. Came about in the 14th and 15th century, but also this concept of keeping people on a ship or on a small neighbouring island for 40 days to clear them before they enter the city or cross over onto the mainland sort of goes back to those times. And for some reason, 40 days, it seems very biblically connected in my mind. Yeah. And of course, we've been quarantining people ever since those days. A lot of people today don't realise that the plague is still in existence. Yeah. Of course, this isn't a medieval disease, of course. It actually remains endemic in countries like Madagascar and the Congo, and would you believe Peru as well. And of course, the prevailing theory for how plague reached Europe is...
I don't know, from Asia, from India, maybe?
Fleas carried on rats, so ships, so trade. I suspected you were going there. Although there are new theories that suggest it was human body lice and even infected grain. And of course, we all know the old nursery rhyme associated with the plague, ring a rosy. So plague was associated with a rosy rash as a symptom of the plague, and of course a pocket full of posies. And posies of herbs were carried as protection to ward off the smell of the disease. And as we remember, the word for disease carried through the air?
Miasma theory.
That's very good. And you might recall those classic get-ups medical practitioners, quacks if you like, used at the time with those kind of bird-like faces with a very, very long nose, which had herbs stuffed into the front end of it to avoid them acquiring the plague through the air.
Okay, that's it. Obviously, if any of these topics interest you, just download the full app. Thanks for listening.